Grief is something all of us experience, and yet so few of us know how to talk about it. We fear it, avoid it, intellectualize it, or tell ourselves to simply move on. Well, what if grief isn't something to get over? What if it is part of us that makes us deeply human? In today's episode, we explore loss in all its forms: the loss of people we love, of relationships, of expectations, of certainty, and sometimes even of the selves we once were. And we ask, how do we continue to live fully in the presence of grief? Hello, everybody. Today on our podcast, Stories Seldom Told, we're joined by Sonali Gupta, one of India's leading clinical psychotherapists. With over 2 decades of experience, Sonali works at the intersection of relationships, anxiety, grief, and compassion. And her work spans therapy, writing, and large-scale mental health advocacy. She's the author of the best-selling book Anxiety, Overcome It, as well as Live Without Fear and You Will Be All Right, a powerful guide to navigating grief from an Indian perspective. Sonali also writes widely read columns, consults with organizations like Tinder, Spotify, and Unilever, and runs one of India's largest mental health focused YouTube channels. It's called Mental Health with Sonali. And another fun fact, if this is not enough, Sonali also created multilingual videos for Sesame Street India around mental health and parenting. We're really glad to have her with us. So, welcome, Sonali. Looking forward to speaking to you.
Thank you, Smita, for having me and the warm introduction. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So, as I've said in my introduction of you, you've the word to me that I would like to focus on over the next half an hour or so is the idea of your learning and your understanding of grief, because grief is a given. All of us have experienced it at some level or another. You could have been in class 2 and some friend of yours is mean to you and you go home crying, or you could be the age you and I are. But it's there. We've all experienced. We know what it feels like. So I would love for you to share a story with us in that context.
So, for me, the beginning of grief began very early in life, and yes, as you said, any loss that we experience is grief. For me, it was more literal, and when I was about 8 years old, my father fell sick and he had diabetes, unmanaged diabetes, and complications that came with it. So, ever since I was 8, it felt there were multiple, it not just felt, there were multiple surgeries, many doctor's appointments, many hospitalizations. And he passed away when I was 33 years old. But ever since I was 8, I thought he was going to die. And every day I would think this. And I didn't tell this to anyone. And this wasn't because I wasn't close to anyone. I was very close to my mom. I lived in a joint family setup. The weird notion you have, you talk about death and you will make it work like a child's mind. So my mind, I was like, how can I even think about it and articulate it? And surprisingly, none of my friends from school or even college had any idea that my father was even ill. So I kept it like a secret, not that anybody asked me to, but they had no idea about it at all. Even at my master's, people didn't know about it, and he was ill all throughout. And my father was very resilient and, in fact, very optimistic. But the seeds of what I figured even after his death, the term in my head, anticipatory loss, I kept thinking of it ever since, I was 8 years old. And he passed away when I was 32, 33 in 2013. So it's also been 13 years to that. I I realized that all these years I had had fear, anxiety, anticipatory loss. And when he passed away, I thought, oh, maybe I kept worrying, thinking it will prepare me for loss. But it actually didn't prepare me for any loss. When it happened, it felt fresh. It felt like, oh, I was never ready for this. And so, yes, so that's my beginning to understanding grief. And yes, that's,
That's
you know,
fascinating,
and often,
Sonali, because what I mean, our listeners may or may not know, but none of these conversations are pre-prepared. I'm hearing your story for the first time, just like the listeners will be hearing it when they tune in. And what you don't know, Sonali, is that we had a very similar experience. I was um, 5 years old. My father had his first heart attack, and I was 32 years old when he passed away. But what's interesting is are you the firstborn? I'm curious to know.
yes,
Right.
yes.
My brother took on the same mantle as you did. So I'm one of three, my brother, sister, and I. I'm the youngest.
Hmm.
For my entire life with my father, I would not have ever called him unwell. I didn't see him as unwell. But he had lots of medications all the time. But my brother, on the other hand, took on the same mantle as you did. He never articulated it. He never said it out aloud. If you say it out loud, it might come true, right? And that's really interesting. Um, that we go through a lifetime, because it is 8 to 33 or 5 to 32 or whatever it might be, um, a lifetime of appreciating that the idea of death. What does even death mean? What does an 8-year old even know about death? And yet, what you're saying is when the death actually happens, there is zero preparation. So, what does that mean then? Because you've said it to yourself on and off, obviously not all the time, but it's just there, low lying in your mental psyche for pretty much all of your life, up to the age of 33. But what was that moment when that happened? How did you react when you finally knew?
So my father had a sense that he was dying and he was turning 60. So and he generally, I come from a family where intuition is a gift. And I have inherited that gift, and I have it both from my paternal and maternal side. My granddad was a doctor, and he could an Ayurvedic doctor, and he could see, when people were close to dying, he could see it from their eyes. He wouldn't tell them, but he knew it, and he worked in 93. And my father also had a very strong sense of intuition. So my maternal granddad, who was a doctor, had it, and my father, and I've also inherited, and I think all of us have cultivated it over the years. So my father did tell us, and I don't think I've ever articulated it. And you sharing your story makes me also wonder how stories can be so similar, and a podcast brings us together, which is magical in that sense. Really, really. Because we have spoken before, but this never came out, right, Smita? We met at a
Absolutely.
fest, but we never discussed
We
this.
never discussed this.
Absolutely. So my father had a sense, and 10 days before, 10 to 15 days, before he passed away, he said that his birthday falls on 1st May, and around 25th April, he started saying, I wouldn't live, and he passed away in May, early May. So we had a sense of it, but he was fine. And then suddenly his health deteriorated one of the nights after his birthday, and then he passed away. I I felt various things. One, there was this feeling of shock and disbelief because the idea of death just feels odd because the person is there, the funeral hasn't happened, and you don't know what does it mean when someone has gone away. You can see them and they are not there. The second is, I remember on the day of my father's funeral, I am very contained. I I can have a veneer of that things are fine. This is how I look through most situations in my life. And maybe it's a developed skill set over the years. So my grief shows up physically, and it shows up in the form of, at this particular time, it showed up in the form of hunger. I remember my father was supposed to be, the cremation was about to start in an hour or so. I remember feeling extremely, extremely hungry, and nobody was eating. People feel that their hunger goes away. And I feel the exact opposite. I feel massively hungry. I feel I'm going to faint, all of it. And it's not, when my father-in-law passed away, also, I remember I felt the same thing. So it showed up physically for me. And also, it really was a realization that all this holding off of anxiety and this psychological preparation was not, didn't help at all. And you're never really prepared. You have to deal with it when it happens. And I've dealt with the grief over the years in many, many ways.
Mm. Because grief is a funny thing, and funny as an ironic funny. And I'm sure you have read about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And when you were talking to me, I was thinking of those ideas of, immobilization and denial and so on. And it seems to me what you're saying is no matter what the grief is, something as catastrophic or as losing a parent, or perhaps something, perhaps from the larger society perspective, not as catastrophic, but it is to you, it is still the same process. That's what you're saying. And all of us, the world over, go through this phase, this reaction, seeing, and again, and you're talking to me, and I can't help but visualize myself flying to India, going to my parents' home, seeing him lie there, and he's there, but he's not there. I'm there with you in this conversation. But what about those listeners who might have lost a parent and yet don't connect with what you're saying, perhaps because their relationship is very different? Perhaps, I don't know. Are there variations to the idea of grief when something like this happens?
Absolutely. And let me look at it from two perspectives. One is the relationship you share with your parent. So, in the book, You Will Be All Right, A Guide to Navigating Grief, I talk about people who had a very ambivalent relationship with their parent, where there were mixed feelings. Think about in situations where you're estranged from your parent. A lot of my clients in therapy work, they are estranged. They have sometimes not seen their parent for 30 years at stretch,
Exactly.
or
That's
even
why I was
more.
asking. Mm.
Yes. And then if you were with a parent who's an alcoholic, who's struggling with alcoholism, or if you were taking care of a parent who struggles with severe mental health concerns, or a parent who was, where the relationship was fraught because there was neglect, or you both could never see an eye to eye on anything, and there was a lot of friction. Grief, in those setups, there is grief, but how it can show up will really, really vary. Sometimes people feel that, clients have said it, that I didn't even get a chance at closure. Now the person is no more. There's no one who I can get an answer from. So they actually feel abandoned and angry because they feel there's now no way to get closure. The person has passed away. And what happens to their wounds? There are other times where no matter how your relationship with your parent is, if they were very, very, even if you had a very good and steady relationship, but they were ill for years, or particularly if they were struggling with alcohol or they were struggling with an illness for really long, A lot of times, in fact, I mention it in the book. And, when I was going to literature festivals with the book last year, in fact, this is something a lot of people would talk about, how when their parent passed away, they felt a sense of relief.
I was going to say
Bec-
that because the relief is a big one. You want release for that person. You might love them, you might have a close relationship, but they've been unwell for 6 months or 1 year or whatever it might be. Or, for example, there could be somebody who is very, very old, who has lived their full life, who no longer wants to live, but body is keeping them alive.
Absolutely. So, but also a relief that they felt, the surviving members felt, because they felt that, okay, now they can also, they are relieved that the person is no longer in pain, but also that they can have a life. Sometimes in therapy, I work with a lot of caregivers. Some of them have been caregivers for 20 years, for 2 decades of their life. And, I mention it in the book, that one of my clients, was a caregiver. And then her daughter telling her that, Mom, you can have a life now. And my client had been caregiving for 20 years, telling her that, you can live, you can go out. She had not headed out of home really. She had not traveled, not taken a flight for years. And while the mom said she was not ready for any of it, at some point the client did say that, I do feel relief. That whether I go or not go is a different story. I have choice now. I never had that choice for years at a stretch. And she also said that, you know how much I loved my husband, because we were in therapy for a longish time, 7, 8 years. So she said, you know that. I said, yes, absolutely. And you were always there. At the same time, now just the fact that I have choice makes me feel that, I can move on with my life. Otherwise, it felt like life had just stopped for me for days. So the biggest thing, Smita, about grief, which people miss, is that two opposing emotions can coexist. You can feel relief and you can still be grieving deeply, and sadness, melancholy can coexist. And people often miss that out. I feel grief is an emotion which we are so scared of that we as a society don't even try to understand it. And and I want to share an anecdote here. So when I was going for one of the literature festivals, I was at the airport, and as usual, you sign books, before when you're going on your way. So I was signing books, and there's this gentleman who walks towards me, and and he sees that I'm signing. He looks at the book, he buys the book. So I ask his name, I ask him what does he do, and I'm signing the book, and I'm like, hope you enjoy reading the book. And he says he's a doctor, and he says, uh, actually, I'm not going to read the book. I said, you don't need to buy it just because I'm there. You should not buy the book.
Exactly.
He said, no. He said, no, just having the book on my mantle, which says you will be all right, a guide to navigating grief, tells me I'll be fine when I need it in my life. So this is my way of keeping the hope there.
That's delightful. That is so sweet. I think that is just quite charming, actually. I mean, there's a lot going on here, but I know that you have so many stories, Sonali. So could you share another story with us?
All right, let me share this story because it will add to what we started the conversation with. I I knew ever since I was 7, 8 that I wanted to be a therapist. And maybe it was around the same time when my dad fell ill. Now I don't have a clear memory to it, but I'm assuming that. And my mom would, read a lot, and a lot of back then, even if there was one column that came in the paper, she would cut it out and keep for me. And she would tell me how I would make a good therapist, back so many years back also. So I'm not thought of anything other than being a therapist ever. This is the only career, and I knew ever since I was 7 years old. I was extremely, extremely scared that, of death, which everyone is. And when you have a parent who's ill, you're aware of every hospitalization feels that there could be something going wrong there. So when I started working, I, I kind of told myself unconsciously in my head that I want to stay away from situations where there's grief, loss. I'll work around therapy. And I was 22 when I started working. And I started working with children of sex workers in a red light area. And I enter my workplace the first day, and this 7, 8 year old girl comes running to me and she's crying and she hugs me really tight and she says that her mom is dying, and that her mom has been diagnosed with AIDS and she's not going to make it alive. She has been told that there are very few days now that she has, and her mom did pass away a few days in the diagnosis. And this is many years back, more than 20 years back, just when I started, 21, 22 years back. And I often think back to it to because of two reasons. So I worked with this little girl. A, she instinctively trusted me. She didn't even know me. And we worked around. She didn't get to see her mom in the last days when the mom passed away. We talked about what it would mean for her to write to her mom whatever she wanted. How does she process it? And because she's 7, 8 years old, more than talking, we use other forms where she put down everything in a letter. She talked about what she misses. And we continued the work even after her mom's demise. Regularly, I would see her, sometimes multiple times in the week. But this always comes back to me because I've also figured that no matter how much I've tried to run away from loss and said I won't deal with it, or I don't want to deal with death, grief, other forms of therapy, it keeps coming back. Also, when my father passed away, uh, I had started working with a lot of people who were struggling with suicide, who would harm themselves, and I was fairly good at managing those situations. I made a call when my father passed away in 2013. Oh, I'm going to now not do all of this work. I'll just do relationship. So 2 years in, I move into relationship work and I'm largely doing it. And I realize all relationship work is grief work. All relationship work is grief work.
We have to
I
laugh
think,
in a podcast on grief. Hmm.
there is no running away. And if you're in relationships, to what you started the podcast with, there is losing. We are, lost expectations are losses. Every time you have an expectation in a relationship, in a marriage, and they are not met over a period of time, they feel like losses.
Of
And for
course, it,
everyone who's married, who knows that. With your siblings, when things don't, whether your parent is alive or not, with siblings, there are so many times where it feels like a loss because you were not understood or seen. And anyone who has siblings will talk about it. But also friendship losses. Like a lot of my clients in therapy talk about friendship. It's a massive topic in therapy
hmm.
for me. And there are so many betrayals in friendship, and so many times people have said, it really feels like a loss, and I don't know how to describe it. And now we still have a vocabulary. I'm talking about 20 years back when I started. People they didn't know how to describe a friendship loss. So I've realized that no matter how much I've tried all my life running away from anticipatory loss, grief, I keep life has a way of pulling me back in and reminding me it's an existential reality. There's no way I'm going to run away from it. And we are also doing a podcast on this topic. So
Well, to me,
I've embraced.
it was a given, Sonali, when we met at the literature festival. It's exactly for the reasons you've just said, because grief is a given, and grief could mean absolutely anything. It could even mean that I don't know, while you're asleep, your favorite car parked on the street is broken into and completely destroyed. You have grief there too, inanimate object, and so it's what if you were to really simplify that word. What is grief? What does that mean? If you can just make us, articulate that for us.
When anything we love, when we lose that, it is grief at the end of the day. So it could be for me, for example, in the pandemic, I used to rent out a cottage in Khar, and in Bombay, having a cottage is really a luxury of all kinds that one can ask for about a good 8 years. And in the pandemic, we had to give away the place because no clients were coming for in person. I had very, very good people who I worked with, and they were super easy. They in fact didn't even charge us during the pandemic. I remember in April, May, June when we didn't use it, and then they said that in July saying, "Listen, if you're not coming back, we want to." And we told them we'll still pay. They said no, but if you're not coming back, we'll give it. And that was completely understandable because I knew for at least next 2 years, it didn't mean that one would come back. One didn't know it then, and later I figured more than 2 years. But that felt like loss because it was a place I deeply loved. There was a sense of identity. So, women at IVF clinic waiting is a reminder of loss. Men or women who never got appreciation from their parents or a line saying, you never disappointed me. That also
It is a
feels like
loss.
loss, right? So we are surrounded by loss. There is loss in every possible way. For a child who fell down and the parent didn't look at it loving them and said that you will be fine, also feels like a loss to a child because the child is told that you're stupid, you always make these mistakes. It feels like in that moment the child needed affection. The loss can be experienced in so many ways. So when we lose someone who we love, but also loss of loss of values, our role models, people we looked up to, when they either disappoint us or don't show up in ways we want. Loss of values in a world we live in where you don't they are where there's disillusionment, there's always a feeling of loss, a deep feeling of grief. Or when
This
for
is
me,
very, yeah, this is so important, Sonali, because your explanation of grief is crucial for our understanding. And the idea, even something as ephemeral as loss of values, I mean, what does that even mean, right? And you have a mentor, you have a guide, it could even be your own parent or your sibling or your very good friend, and they let you down. And that is a loss. So you mentioned something, when you said that from the age of 8, you wanted to be a therapist, and you laughingly said, I don't know whether it's because my father fell ill at the same age, give or take. It could have been first, it could have been second. I suspect the father falling ill was first, and the idea of wanting to be a therapist being second. And the question I want to ask you is how much of our own narrative, of our own personal experiences, influence and impact on how we approach grief that then happens to us later. So, just to give context on what I mean by this question, um, not necessarily you, it could be anybody else. For example, you are, 8, 10, 15 years old, something happens to you. It could even be something, as I said, about your values, because I think that's very powerful, and not a lot of people appreciate that. And you are let down, you have a sense of loss. Does that not then continue to impact? And you are now 45 years old, let's just say. This happened to you when you were 8 years old or 10 years old. Would you say that in the next 30 years, 35 years of your life, this continues to impact implicitly, unconsciously, without you even realizing it, in the way you approach other aspects of grief, not necessarily anything to do with this?
yes, absolutely, in the way that it would impact. And one of the decisions to also work as a therapist is because when my father was in hospital, I realized there isn't much support. Nobody really tells you things. I also felt there was nobody to listen. So the entire idea, and you're right, and even I suspect that he fell sick and I wanted people to listen. and somebody to listen in a safe, non-judgmental way. Also, uh, the downside of being sensitive is you don't want to make other people worried. So I would not talk to anyone who's directly involved with me. So being a therapist is inspired from the idea that the space I never got, others should have that space. So clearly, without knowing the word grief, I had made my choice saying it's a way of building hope and meaning making for me. That when I grow up, I become a therapist. I build this space from a value standpoint. I create this space where there's hope and people can listen to. But also, to what you're saying, I grew up in a family where my granddad was a doctor and he worked, maternal granddad in Punjab, and I would go there. uh, the family was built around the spirit of service, so it was deeply entrenched within the family. And I can use the word now because I went to my and the timing of this is so beautiful because I went to my mom's home, just a month back, and I was reminded of that spirit of service. So I feel that both the good, the while my father was struggling, I could also see my granddad, as a doctor doing a lot, the spirit of service. And knowing he held up his value of that everybody should have access to care. It doesn't matter whether people have resources or not. So I feel the good intentions, the resilience of my father, everything around implicitly, not explicitly. I have a language for it now as a 44-year-old. But did I have a language for it? No. And at the same time, now it feels all put together and coming together as one story. But I remember when I was writing the book in 22, 23 on grief, 23 when I was writing the book on grief, I had a realization that, you know, uh, a lot of times I've thought that a lot of people have not dealt with grief and how their life would have felt easier when I was younger, they were feeling. And then while writing the book, I had this, while the end of the book was coming, I had finished writing it almost end of 23. I had a feeling that not a feeling, a realization that my ambition for life comes because I have seen life being so fragile. So I have this massive ambition for life, and it's ambition for life, not career. It's really this ambition for life, this zest to do so many things. And I really, really owe it to seeing, knowing that time is limited. So when time is limited, how does one maximize and live life? So to what you asked, I didn't realize it for all these years. And even in my father's illness and in his death, he taught me how to live. And that's the biggest gift, really. I just feel so emotional even thinking about this.
That is just so moving, Sonali, because again, I think we have that in common. Um, because even though my father was a heart patient, in inverted commas, he was 37 years old when he had his massive heart attack and was in ICU for 48 hours, will not live, and then did live until the age of 63. But his entire life was one of positivity, of looking outwards, of not feeling sorry for himself, of engaging with what life gives us. And implicitly, unconsciously, we embrace that, all three of us, and my mother. Our life was very much not one of, oh no, it wasn't any of that. Now, if your father or my father had been different, we would have been different. And so you and I were blessed. We were blessed in the parent we had, who was unwell at a very young age and died at a very young age, but in those intervening years taught us how to live life to the best and to grab it, to love it, to engage with it, to celebrate it. But you are lucky, I'm lucky. What do you say to those people who don't have that luck? Because we're not all the same, and we know that well enough. And there would be many a person who may not have the same story as us, but, for example, buries it. They don't want to think about it because the trauma of grief is so much that thinking about it raises other emotions, and they can't get up in the morning and go to work and can live with their family or their friends. It doesn't matter how old you are. So they feel instinctively that the best way to approach that grief, and that could be 30 years ago, is to bury it. And I'll share a story. This was a very long time ago when I was training to be a coach, and I was talking to somebody, and he shared a story with me that he had been to a bereavement counselor because his dog died, and he was struggling very much to manage after his dog had died. But he realized during the counseling that, and I'm trying to remember the exact facts, 40 years earlier, this is a very, very old story, he had been a soldier during war. And the traumas that he had seen, the PTSD, the post traumatic stress disorder that all of us, even non therapists, have read about, had been lying low. He had not acknowledged it. And it was the death of his dog that finally just opened up what was in his head, and he was grieving for many, many, many losses. How do you respond to that?
And I'm glad that he found the courage to reach out when he did. And yet, there's something which is very, very common where people reach out in therapy, not for, he did reach out when he lost a pet. And I do have a lot of clients who do reach out for that. But also, a lot of my clients have reached out to me for how they're feeling numb. They are not able to love. They feel there's a sadness that constantly lurks. And when we work around it, sometimes it's in the first year, sometimes even as much as in the second or third year, people begin talking about their grief. And to what you said, I've also had clients who have not talked about their grief for as much as 50 years.
50,
So
you're
they
talking.
are
50. Yes.
absolutely, they are in their late 50s or in their early to late 60s, and they are telling me about losses, sometimes abuse that happens. So grief and trauma both. Sometimes a loss of a loved one, a teacher, a neighbor who they deeply love. That happened when they were 5, 6 years old, and now they are 67 years old. And when I ask them, they tell me that they've never told this to anyone. Sometimes loss of someone very important to them that happened under strange circumstances or a suicide, and they never could speak about it. And it took them 50 years, 40 years, 30 years. That's something I've seen over and over. In my book, in the context of delayed grief, I talk about it as my sense, my understanding, working with these clients, and I'm talking about these specific clients that I've seen a pattern. The act of not processing their grief leaves them stuck at a level where some of them struggle even to love, because they feel that if they fall in love again, there will be loss again. So if they don't want to feel grief all over again, they should just not fall in love at all
Which
with
is so
anyone.
sad. Which is so sad. So there was something else that you were talking about as well, Sonali, and the idea of grief. You talked about being 8 or 18 or 67. And so give us a little bit more learning about this idea of travel or the time of grief.
There is no timeline to grief, and there is no hierarchy to grief. So, all then I think, but two of the biggest myths that exist is people believe that if you had a loss, you lost someone, or if there's loss of values over a period of time, you will forget about it. I don't think we forget people who we love, values that are important to us. We don't forget. We build our life around memories of people who we love. They continue to remain a part of us, right? For all of us, I lost my mom-in-law 6 months. Oh, now it's going to be a year. And, when I'm going to a wedding and I carry her shawl, a Kashmiri shawl, it's carrying a part of her. My father loved his food, and every time I enjoy food, I think of him. So and it's been years, and I will still cry thinking of my father. And clients will say 50 years sometimes, and they will still have tears on their birthdays. The sessions that happen when the client's parents' birthday it is, and I've been really fortunate to witness those moments where the client will tell me that my parent would have been 90 today, and today is their birthday, and they are really, really emotional. So I don't think there is a timeline to grief. The intensity and the frequency of how the feelings emerge, the big feeling, that changes. Grief just changes its shape in that sense. But the loss stays. And the other big myth, which I feel does a lot of disservice, is believing there's a hierarchy to grief, to what you asked earlier. A lot of my clients have reached out in therapy when they lost their pets, and some of them were told that you're grieving too much over a pet. To them, their pet is their baby, their child, their
Absolutely.
pet is everything. Or like a client of mine who lost their grandmom at 95, and somebody at the funeral said, "Oh, you're very lucky your grandmom lived till 95. Why are you even crying? You have no reason." And the client came back and said, "Listen, I was completely raised by my grandmother. My mom and dad were not around. To me, it's loss of my family. I feel like an orphan. And because someone died at 95 doesn't mean you won't miss them. Cognitively, yes, that they led a full life, but every loss is valid. And when we trivialize losses, like when to a pet owner, to a pet parent, when you say something so insensitive, or when you put a hierarchy to losses in ways, either in the context of age or other ways, we are taking away from the loss that people have experienced. All we can say is, tell me, what can I do for you? I'm sorry for your loss. Is there anything I can do to help? But to say these things, to say things like, "Oh, you should be stronger now, your mom needs you or your father needs you," it doesn't help. And I feel as a society, we need to learn how to be sensitive, even in our language and the way we communicate grief. Otherwise, we are not giving people the permission to grieve. What you already asked about, Smita, right? That it takes away from people's right to grieve.
I think that's very, very crucial. And I really appreciate you saying this, Sonali, because it's not just when we say society, I mean, this podcast is heard in many countries around the world. And we're not talking just about India. Whether it's the UK or the US or New Zealand or Kazakhstan or wherever it might be, the world over, there is a commonality. We assume certain things, and then we think that we're supporting our friend or our whoever it might be by telling them to get over it and get on with it. Whereas, who are we to make that decision? And what you're saying is just be there for them. That's all we can do, and that's all we must do. I mean, obviously, your work, you can't give us a one short answer fits all. That's not what it's about. But is there any small little sub nugget that our listeners can take away for them to think about and reflect on?
One, that the first big one would be to not be scared of the word grief and what it entails. I feel the word itself has become like Voldemort, something that shouldn't be spelled out, like death. The very fact that people can't state it also sometimes. People will not even use the word grief. So to to give yourself, if just one, to give yourself the permission to feel. Because a lot of times when it comes to big feelings, we don't allow ourselves to feel. And now we live in times where we can do thousand things and not feel. We can look at our phone, we can go online, we can watch stuff for hours. We don't sit with ourselves. So to allow, the idea is to not ruminate or to stay, to wallow in it, but to give yourself the permission to feel, and know that feelings will emerge and they will also go away. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in fact, in her book, talks about when she's experiencing grief, that when a low mood, when melancholy comes, she sees melancholy as a visitor that comes unannounced, but also that leaves, that doesn't stay. So, to be able to see feelings as they come and they will also pass away, which is also what one does in meditation, but to see them as fleeting and to acknowledge their presence and not be scared of it.
To instinctively, I mean, to sit with yourself is such a simple phrase. And I love the way you said that. So I think that's a good note to end, Sonali. And I really appreciate your sharing these wise thoughts and the learning that all of us, the world over, will take away on how we manage our own personal grief. Sonali Gupta, thank you very much for sharing your stories seldom told.
Thank you for making me part of this.